Some structures were built so precisely, so deliberately, that modern engineers still can't fully explain how they did it. Walls fitted without mortar so tight you can't slide a blade between the stones. Tombs engineered to catch the light of a single sunrise once a year, for 5,000 years straight. These aren't famous places. Most of them don't even have Wikipedia pages. But they were built, documented, and somehow the world just moved on without them. Like and subscribe before we begin, because what you're about to hear might still be on your mind long after you've drifted off. Let's go. Ollantaytambo wall blocks. There is a town in the sacred valley of the Incas, in the Cusco region of southern Peru, where the past and the present occupy the same space with an ease that few places in the world can match. Ollantaytambo sits at the confluence of two rivers, the Urubamba and the Paracancha, surrounded by mountains that rise on every side with a dramatic verticality that the Andes reserve for their most significant valleys. The town itself is extraordinary. Its street grid follows the original Inca plan. Its water channels still carry water through stone-lined courses. Its residents still live in houses whose lower walls were built by Inca hands. But above the town, climbing the steep flank of the mountain that rises on its western side, there is a ceremonial and military complex of terraces and temples and storage structures that represents the Inca Empire at its most ambitious and its most technically accomplished. And at the heart of that complex, on the highest terrace, there is a wall, or rather, the beginning of a wall, a temple that was never completed, whose construction raises questions about the nature of Inca engineering that researchers are still working to fully answer. The wall blocks of Ollantaytambo are the largest stones the Inca ever attempted to use in construction. 6 of them still stand in their intended positions on the high terrace. Enormous pink granite monoliths fitted together with the same dry stone precision that characterizes all Inca masonry. No mortar, no adhesive, just stone against stone, the joints so tight that a blade of grass cannot be inserted between them. The surfaces worked to a flatness and a smoothness that speaks of tools and techniques and an understanding of stone that modern engineers regard with genuine respect. These blocks did not come from the mountain above Ollantaytambo. They were quarried from a site called Cachicada on the opposite side of the Urubamba River Valley, several kilometers away and hundreds of meters higher in elevation. The logistical challenge of moving them down the steep quarry slopes, across the river, up the terraced mountainside to their final position, was enormous by any standard of engineering, ancient or modern. And yet they were moved. The evidence is there in the valley below the site, scattered along the ancient transport route, in various stages of completion and positioning. There are additional blocks that never reached the temple, abandoned, when the construction was interrupted by the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. These unfinished stones are among the most poignant objects in the Inca world. Massive, carefully worked, hauled partway across a valley by an empire that ceased to exist before the work could be completed. The 6 standing blocks of the Sun Temple wall are fitted together with a complexity that goes beyond simple flat joints. Between the main blocks, smaller stones called splines fill the vertical gaps, their shapes precisely cut to fit the specific space between their neighbors, each one unique, each one the product of careful measurement and patient stonework. The overall surface of the wall reads as a single unified plane, the joints between blocks visible, but not disruptive. The whole thing presenting itself as a coherent architectural statement rather than an assembly of separate elements. What the temple would have been, had it been completed, is a matter of informed speculation. The terraces below it, which are complete, are among the finest agricultural and ceremonial terracing in the Inca world. Broad, level platforms retained by beautifully built stone walls, connected by stairways of single stone slabs, each one a piece of landscape engineering that transformed a near vertical mountainside into a series of usable and elegant horizontal spaces. The temple above them, had it been finished, would have crowned this complex with a structure whose scale and ambition matched the landscape it was built into. The mountains above Ollantaytambo are not passive backdrops. In the Andean cosmological tradition, mountains are living beings, apus, divine presences whose moods and intentions shape the lives of the communities in their shadow. The choice of this particular location for the Incas' most ambitious construction project was not made on logistical grounds alone. The site sits within a landscape understood as sacred in its entirety. The rivers and the mountains and the carved stone all participating in a single coherent vision of the relationship between the human world and the divine geography of the Andes. The wall blocks of Ollantaytambo are the most tangible expression of that vision. They were moved across impossible terrain and fitted together with impossible precision, not simply because the Inca were capable of it, though they were, but because the temple they were building required that level of effort and that level of care. The scale of the stones was itself a statement, a measure of the seriousness of the intention behind the construction. They stand today in the Andean light, pink granite against the blue sky, the river audible in the valley below and the mountains present on every side. 6 blocks, fitted together without mortar, abandoned halfway through a project that the world interrupted before it could be finished. They are enough. They tell the whole story of ambition and skill and the human insistence on building something worthy of the landscape and the moment, even when the moment, as it always does, eventually runs out. Gurness Cairn. There is an island within an island in Orkney. Sanday is one of the larger islands of the Orkney archipelago, lying to the northeast of the Orkney mainland across a stretch of water that in bad weather is one of the more unforgiving passages in the North Atlantic. Sanday is a low island, remarkably low, its highest points barely rising above the surrounding sea, its landscape defined not by hills and dramatic coastal cliffs, but by the long pale curves of its beaches and the flat agricultural land that lies between them. From certain angles and in certain lights, Sanday appears to float on the surface of the sea rather than rise from it, a thin green line between 2 shades of blue. On a peninsula at the southwestern end of Sanday, a finger of land called Else Ness that reaches into the sea on 3 sides. There is a Neolithic cairn that sits in this open, sea-surrounded landscape with a presence that its modest exterior dimensions do not fully prepare you for. It is called Gurness, and the space it contains within its carefully built stone walls is one of the most remarkable interior experiences that any prehistoric monument in Scotland has to offer. The cairn dates to around 2900 BCE, placing it in the same broad tradition of Neolithic chambered tomb building that produced Maeshowe on the Orkney mainland and the Great Passage tombs of Ireland. The Orkney Islands were, in the Neolithic period, a surprisingly active and well-connected center of monument building. The communities that lived on these northern islands created some of the most sophisticated prehistoric architecture in all of Europe, working in the excellent local sandstone that splits into flat, manageable slabs and builds into walls and chambers of extraordinary precision and durability. Gurness is externally a roughly circular cairn, its outer edge defined by a series of concentric outer walls that surround and support the main cairn body, a technique found at several Orcadian Neolithic monuments that gives the structure both additional stability and a more imposing visual profile than a simple mound would have provided. The outer walls step inward and upward, creating a tiered effect that from the outside reads as a deliberate architectural statement, rather than a purely functional arrangement. The entrance to the cairn faces southwest, toward the sea that surrounds the Ellesness Peninsula on 3 sides. The entrance passage is long and low, nearly 9 meters from the outer wall to the central chamber, a distance that must be covered in a stooped or crawling posture, the stone walls pressing close on either side and the roof descending until the passage feels less like a corridor and more like the earth itself opening reluctantly to admit you. The chamber at the end of that passage is the reward for the discomfort of the approach. It is tall, nearly 4 meters from floor to the top of the corbelled roof, and it opens into a space that, after the compression of the passage, feels genuinely expansive. The corbelling is the technical achievement that makes this height possible, each course of stone projecting slightly inward from the one below, the circles diminishing upward in a slow spiral until they meet at the capstone. The whole structure held in place by the weight and geometry of the stones themselves rather than by any mortar or adhesive. 6 small side cells open off the main chamber, 3 on each side, their low entrances requiring you to duck to enter them. These cells were the actual burial spaces, the places where the bones of the community's dead were placed and accumulated over the generations of the cairn's use. The main chamber was the gathering space, the processional arrival point, the architectural statement. The cells were the intimate repositories of the dead, each one a small dark room holding the physical remains of people whose names are entirely lost. Archaeologists excavating coinus in the 19th century found the remains of at least 10 adults and 5 children within the cairn, along with the bones of animals and fragments of pottery. The human remains showed evidence of having been moved and rearranged, bones sorted and gathered, the dead organized within the space in ways that suggest the tomb was regularly opened and revisited. The relationship between the living community and its accumulated dead maintained through ongoing ritual engagement rather than sealed off at the moment of burial. The location of coinus on the peninsula is not incidental. The choice to build on this particular finger of land, surrounded by the sea on 3 sides, placing the dead in a position that is literally between the land and the water, speaks of a cosmological understanding in which the boundary between worlds was a significant and meaningful location. The dead at coinus are neither fully on the land nor fully in the sea. They occupy a threshold, a between place, which in many traditions is precisely where the dead are understood to reside. The sea around Elsness is always present at coinus, audible even from within the cairn on days when the wind is running, visible from the entrance as you emerge from the passage and straighten up and blink in the Orkney light. The tidal patterns around the peninsula are complex, the water moving in different directions at different states of the tide, and the light that comes off that moving water changes the color and the quality of everything it touches on the land around the cairn. In winter, when the Orkney weather is at its most serious, and the wind comes off the North Atlantic with a force that makes outdoor work a matter of physical negotiation, the cairn would have been a place of absolute shelter. The thick stone walls blocking the wind entirely, the corbelled roof keeping out the rain, the interior dark and still and completely separate from the violence of the weather. Outside, there is something deeply human about that shelter, that ancient provision for the dead of a space where the elements cannot reach them. Coinus is not an easy place to reach. Sanday requires a ferry crossing from the Orkney mainland, and Elsness requires a walk across the low farmland of the peninsula from the nearest road. The journey filters the visitors naturally. Those who arrive have made an effort, have chosen this place specifically, and tend to bring with them the quality of attention that the cairn rewards. The Orkney light in the late afternoon, when it comes from low in the southwestern sky and falls directly toward the entrance of the cairn, has a quality that is difficult to describe and impossible to forget. It is golden and level and extraordinarily clear, and it reaches into the entrance passage of coinus with a warmth that seems almost deliberate, as though the cairn was built to receive exactly this light at exactly this angle. Perhaps it was. The Neolithic builders of Orkney understood solar orientation with a precision that we have found encoded in their greatest monuments. Whether coinus carries a specific astronomical alignment is not fully established, but the southwestern entrance, facing the direction of the winter sunset, suggests an orientation toward the dying of the light that is consistent with the symbolic concerns of a culture that built its tombs as places where the dead could receive the last warmth of the year. Stand at the entrance to coinus, in that late afternoon light, the sea glinting on 3 sides of the peninsula, and the old stones warm beneath your hand, and feel how complete this place is, how fully it belongs to its landscape, how naturally the human intention of the builders and the ancient geography of this northern island have arrived, across 5,000 years, at something that feels entirely and quietly right. Dun Dornagil Broch. There is a place in the far north of Scotland, in the county of Sutherland, where the landscape achieves a kind of severity that is difficult to describe without resorting to the language of extremes. This is not the gentle highland scenery of the tourist imagination, not the soft green hills and mirror lochs of the central highlands, not the romantic moorland of the shooting estates. This is something harder and older and more indifferent to human comfort. The mountains here are ancient and heavily eroded, their flanks covered in bog and heather, their summits bare rock worn smooth by the action of ice and wind and the slow, patient chemistry of rain across hundreds of millions of years. The river Strathmore runs through this landscape in the valley that shares its name, a river that in spate carries the dark, peaty water of the surrounding bog with a force and a color that make it look less like water and more like the landscape itself in liquid form. The valley is remote by the standards of the modern world, reached by single-track roads that require patience and a willingness to reverse for sheep. And in the Iron Age it would have been more remote still, a far northern territory at the edge of the inhabited world as the people of that era understood it. And yet someone built here. Someone chose this valley, this river, this particular bend in the Strathmore, where the ground rises slightly from the floodplain, and raised a brush that has been standing in this unlikely place for more than 2,000 years. Dundornagle, sometimes spelled Dundornadilla, is one of the best preserved brochs in all of Scotland, which is itself a remarkable statement given how many brochs survive in various states across the northern and western reaches of the country. What distinguishes Dundornagill immediately and visually from most other brochs is the massive triangular lintel stone that spans the entrance passage, an enormous single slab of stone, its lower edge forming the top of the doorway, its upper surface disappearing into the body of the wall above. This triangular lintel is the feature that most visitors remember, and rightly so. It is a piece of prehistoric engineering that combines practical structural logic with a visual drama that seems almost deliberate, almost aesthetic, as though the builders understood that the entrance to such a structure ought to make a statement. The broch stands to a height of around 6 or 7 meters on its best preserved side, considerably lower than its original height, which archaeologists estimate may have reached 10 or 11 meters or more. Even at its current reduced stature, it is a commanding presence in the valley, visible from a considerable distance across the flat bog, its circular tower rising from the surrounding landscape with the same quiet authority that all brochs carry regardless of their state of preservation. The walls are built in the hollow wall technique characteristic of the broch tradition. 2 concentric skins of dry stone masonry with a gap between them, the gap subdivided by stone lintels into cells and a stairway that once wound upward through the interior of the wall to the upper levels of the tower. The outer face of the wall is built from large, carefully selected stones, their surfaces relatively flat, their courses laid with a precision that speaks of builders who understood the behavior of dry stone masonry at height, who knew which stones to use where, how to distribute weight, and manage the subtle outward thrust that a tall circular wall exerts on itself. The entrance passage is low and narrow, as at all brochs, deliberately so, the constriction serving the same defensive logic that governed the design of entrance passages in fortified structures across many cultures and many eras. The triangular lintel above it is not simply a dramatic visual element. It is a structural solution to the problem of spanning a wide opening in a dry stone wall. The triangular form distributing the load of the masonry above to either side of the opening in a way that a flat lintel of similar span could not have managed without risk of failure. Stand in the entrance passage of Dundornagle and look up at that lintel and you feel the intelligence of the people who placed it there, the practical understanding of forces and materials that allowed them to build something that has spanned this opening, without mortar and without failure, for 2,000 years of Scottish weather. The setting of Dundornagle is inseparable from the experience of it. The mountains of Sutherland rise around the valley. Ben Hope, The most northerly Munro in Scotland is visible from the Broch, its summit plateau catching the clouds that stream in from the Atlantic. The river sounds below. The bog stretches away to the south and east in every shade of brown and ochre and the dull gold of winter grass, interrupted here and there by the flash of a locan catching the sky. In this landscape, the Broch would have been the most significant human-made structure for a considerable distance in every direction. It was not just a dwelling or a refuge because it was a landmark, a point of reference in a territory that offered few others, a sign of permanent human presence in a landscape that might otherwise seem to resist permanence entirely. The people who built it were asserting something about their right to be here, their intention to remain, their capacity to create something lasting in a place that the natural world had made difficult and beautiful in equal measure. The community that lived here would have been small, a farming and pastoral settlement, raising cattle and perhaps sheep on the valley floor, fishing the river, managing the limited agricultural potential of a landscape this far north, with the knowledge and the patience that such environments demand. The Broch was their most substantial structure, their most permanent investment in this particular place, and it tells us that despite the difficulty of the environment, they regarded this valley as home in the fullest sense, a place worth building for, worth defending, worth passing down. What has always struck those who make the journey to Dun Dornagle is the combination of isolation and intimacy that the site produces. The landscape is vast and indifferent and ancient, but the Broch itself, when you reach it and stand at its entrance and run your hand along the stones of its wall, is immediate and human in its scale and its craftsmanship. The stones were chosen and placed by hands. The entrance was sized for a human body. The cells within the wall were spaces where a person could sit or sleep or store something precious. The vast landscape and the human-scaled structure exist together at Dun Dornagle, in a relationship that feels, somehow, like the whole of the human story compressed into a single image, the smallness of what we make set against the enormity of what surrounds us, and the extraordinary stubbornness with which we make it anyway, and the way what we make sometimes lasts long after everything else about us has been absorbed back into the indifferent, ancient earth. The river Strathmore runs on, the mountains hold their ground, and Dun Dornagle stands in its valley, triangular lintel and hollow walls and all, exactly where someone decided 2,000 years ago that it ought to stand. Temple of Cardaki. There is a place on the island of Corfu, on the northeastern coast of the Ionian Sea, where the land meets the water with a particular Mediterranean grace. The shoreline here is rocky and clear, the sea a shade of blue that shifts between turquoise and deep green depending on the depth and the angle of the light, and the air carries that combination of salt and pine resin and warm stone that belongs specifically to the Greek islands in the way that certain smells belong specifically to certain memories. Olive trees grow on the slopes above the water. Cypress trees stand at intervals against the sky like dark exclamation marks in a landscape that is otherwise all horizontal ease and warmth. Just south of the modern town of Corfu, in an area known as Cardaki, there is a spring that has been flowing from the hillside since antiquity, cool, reliable, the kind of water source that in the ancient world immediately acquired sacred significance because reliable water, in a dry Mediterranean landscape, was understood as a gift that required acknowledgement and reciprocation. And beside that spring, built to honor whatever divine presence was understood to inhabit and protect it, there stands the remains of one of the oldest Doric temples in the Greek world. The Temple of Cardaki. Small, weathered, partially ruined, almost entirely unknown outside the community of classical archaeologists, and utterly extraordinary in its quiet way. The temple dates to around 500 BCE, placing it in the archaic period of Greek history, that long and formative era before the classical age that most people associate with the height of Greek civilization, when the forms and conventions of Greek art and architecture and thought were being established through a process of experiment and refinement that would eventually produce the Parthenon and the tragedies of Sophocles and the philosophy of Plato. Archaic Greece was not a lesser version of classical Greece, it was the crucible in which classical Greece was made. Doric architecture is the oldest and most austere of the three classical orders. Where Ionic architecture adds elegance and Corinthian adds ornament, Doric adds nothing. It strips the column and the entablature back to their essential forms and trusts that those forms, in their pure expression, carry sufficient power and dignity. The columns are relatively thick, their capitals simple, their fluting deep and shadow-catching. The overall effect is one of gravity and solidity, of architecture that knows what it is and requires no decoration to make its point. The Temple of Carnac expresses this Doric austerity with a directness that its small scale only intensifies. This was not a grand civic temple, not the kind of structure that a powerful city-state built to announce its wealth and ambition to the wider Greek world. It was a local sanctuary, connected to that spring, serving the religious needs of the community that lived in this part of Corfu and came to this particular place to address themselves to the divine. The plan of the temple follows the standard archaic Greek form, a rectangular cella, the inner room where the cult image would have stood, preceded by a porch and surrounded on all sides by a single row of columns forming the peristyle. The columns that survive at Carnac are among the most affecting elements of the site, monolithic, meaning each column shaft was cut from a single piece of stone, rather than assembled from drums, a technique characteristic of the earliest phase of Greek temple construction, before the logistical advantages of the drum method became standard practice. Monolithic columns have a different quality than drummed ones. They are heavier in their presence, more insistently material, less the product of a system, and more the product of a specific act of quarrying and transportation and erection that required enormous effort for each individual column. Running your hand along a monolithic column of archaic Greek limestone, you feel the singularity of the stone, its particular grain and texture, the slight irregularities that a single piece of natural material always carries within the imposed geometry of the architectural form. The orientation of the temple is toward the east, as was conventional in Greek sacred architecture. The worshipper entering from the east would face the cult image at the western end of the cella, which was itself oriented to receive the light of the rising sun through the eastern doorway on significant ritual occasions. This solar orientation connects the Temple of Carnac to the same tradition of aligning sacred architecture with the movements of the sun that we have seen across many cultures and many centuries throughout these chapters. The spring beside the temple still flows. This is perhaps the most remarkable fact about Carnac, that the water source which gave the sanctuary its reason for existing is still present, still emerging from the hillside with the same cool reliability that caused someone in the 6th century BCE to decide that this was a place where the divine and the human met and where a temple ought to be built. Water from springs was understood in Greek religious thought as a gift from the gods, specifically in many contexts from the nymphs, the divine female spirits of natural features who were believed to inhabit and animate springs and rivers and groves and mountains. A spring temple was not merely a temple near a convenient water supply. It was a temple at the very location of divine presence, built at the point where the sacred emerged literally from the earth in the form of water that sustained life. The worshippers who came to Carnac came not just to a building, but to a place, to the specific conjunction of spring and stone and sea view, and the quality of light that falls on this particular stretch of Corfu's shoreline, in the particular way that light falls on things near the water. The temple was the frame, the place was the content. Today the Temple of Carnac sits within the grounds of what was once a royal palace, and is now a public garden, somewhat sheltered from casual discovery by its position, away from the main tourist routes of the island. This relative obscurity has in some ways been kind to it. The site has not been overwhelmed by the infrastructure of mass tourism. It retains an atmosphere of genuine quietness, of a place that has not been required to perform its significance for large audiences. Come here in the early morning before the heat of the Corfeo day establishes itself. When the sea below is still and the light is still gathering itself from the eastern horizon, and the columns of the temple are cool to the touch, and the spring is audible nearby, and the air smells of the night's residual coolness mixed with the first warmth of the coming day. The Ionian Sea is there below you, ancient and blue and entirely indifferent to the passage of the 25 centuries that have come and gone since the first worshipper climbed this slope and cupped the spring water in their hands and felt, in the coolness and the reliability of it, the presence of something worth honoring. The temple is small. The spring is quiet. The sea is very old. And the columns stand in the morning light exactly as columns have always stood, patient, vertical, holding up nothing now but the sky, and the memory of the people who placed them here with such care. Cairnpapel Hill Settlement Structures. There is a hill in West Lothian, in the central belt of Scotland, that rises above the surrounding lowlands, with enough prominence to have made it significant to the people who lived in this landscape for thousands of years. It is not a mountain. Scotland has plenty of those, and Cairnpapel Hill makes no claim to compete with them. It is a modest elevation, broad-shouldered and rounded, the kind of hill that a determined walker can reach the summit of without particular effort. But from that summit, on a clear day, the view extends across an extraordinary sweep of Scottish landscape, north to the Highlands, south toward the border country, east to the Firth of Forth and the coast, west toward the mountains of Arran rising from the Firth of Clyde. That view is the key to understanding Cairnpapel. For a community living in this landscape without maps, without the abstracted geographical knowledge that we carry effortlessly today, a hilltop from which you could see in every direction was not merely a pleasant vantage point. It was a place where the world could be understood whole, where the relationship between your own small territory and the wider landscape around it became visible and comprehensible. Such places accumulate meaning. They become the locations where communities choose to mark their presence, to bury their dead, to perform the ceremonies that connect the living to the cosmos they inhabit. Cairnpapel Hill was used as a sacred and ceremonial site across an extraordinarily long span of time, from roughly 3,500 BCE to around 1400 BCE, a period of more than 2,000 years during which the monuments on its summit were built, modified, rebuilt, and reused by successive communities whose relationships with one another and with this particular hilltop shifted and changed across the centuries. The sequence of monuments at Cairnpapel is what makes it so valuable to archaeologists and so fascinating to anyone willing to spend time with its layered history. This is not a single monument with a single story. It is a palimpsest, a surface written over again and again, each generation of builders working with what they found on the hill and making of it something that served their own understanding of what this place was for. The earliest evidence of activity on the hill consists of a series of pits and post holes, some of them containing cremated human remains, arranged in a roughly oval pattern on the summit. These date to the late Neolithic period and represent the first deliberate marking of the hilltop as a place of significance. A cemetery, perhaps, or a ceremonial ground. The specific function less important than the fact of the choice to come here and do something that required effort and intention. In the next phase, the community built a henge, a circular bank and ditch enclosing the hilltop, with two opposing entrances aligned roughly northeast and southwest. Inside the henge, a setting of standing stones was arranged in an oval, echoing the shape of the earlier pit arrangement in a way that suggests continuity of memory or tradition across the generations that separated the two phases of construction. The henge at Cairnpapel was a gathering place, a defined sacred enclosure where the community came together for ceremonies, whose specific nature we cannot recover, but whose importance is encoded in the effort that went into creating the space. The bank and ditch would have marked a clear boundary between the inside of the henge and the world outside it, a physical expression of the conceptual boundary between sacred and ordinary space that underlies the henge tradition across Britain. Burials were made within and around the henge during this phase, individuals interred with care, accompanied by the ceramic vessels and other objects that Neolithic and early Bronze Age communities placed with their dead. One burial, near the center of the monument, was accompanied by a distinctive pottery vessel of a type known as beaker ware, the characteristic ceramic of the early Bronze Age, associated with a period of significant cultural change across Britain and Europe, and with communities that placed great emphasis on individual identity and status in death. The next transformation of the cairn papal monument was dramatic. A large cairn of stones was built over the central area of the henge, covering the earlier burials and creating a new and highly visible monument on the hilltop, a mound that would have been clearly visible from the surrounding landscape, a permanent mark of the community's presence and its relationship with its dead. The cairn was subsequently enlarged, its curb of boulders extended outward to enclose a greater area, additional burials incorporated into its fabric. This sequence of enlargement and incorporation is deeply characteristic of how prehistoric communities related to their monuments. A cairn is not simply built and then left unchanged. It is added to, built around, used as the foundation for new acts of burial and commemoration. Each addition is both a practical decision and a statement of connection to what came before, an assertion that the new dead belong with the old dead, that the living community is continuous with the communities that built and used this place in previous generations. The standing stones of the earlier henge were incorporated into the cairn, buried within its fabric, their original positions preserved, but their visibility ended, the monument of one era becoming the foundation of the next. There is something quietly moving about that incorporation. The stones were not destroyed or discarded. They were kept, held within the new structure, their presence acknowledged even as their form was changed. What survives at Cairn Papal today is managed by Historic Environment Scotland and presented to visitors through a small, interpretive shelter built over the excavated interior of the cairn, allowing people to descend into the monument and see the burial cists and stone settings that excavation revealed. It is an unusual experience, and standing inside a reconstructed prehistoric cairn on a Scottish hilltop, the wind audible above you and the interior dim and close around you. The hilltop itself remains as it has always been, open, wide-skied, commanding that same extraordinary view across the Scottish central belt that made it significant to the first communities who climbed it and decided to stay. The monuments have changed across 5,000 years of human use and natural weathering, but the view has not changed in any essential way. The same hills are visible to the north. The same firths gleam to east and west. The same sky turns above the summit through its daily and seasonal cycles. Come to Cairn Papal on a clear autumn morning when the air has the sharp quality that Scottish autumn produces, and the light is low and golden across the central belt, and stand on the summit and turn slowly through the full compass of the view. The hill holds you at its center, the landscape arranged around you in every direction, and you understand without needing to be told why people have been coming to this particular place to mark their most significant moments for more than 5,000 years. Bryn Celyn Ddu Passage Tomb. There is a field on the island of Anglesey, off the northwestern coast of Wales, where the land is green and level, and the sky above it feels particularly large, the kind of sky that belongs to places near the sea, where the horizon is wide and the clouds move with a purpose that inland skies do not quite manage. Anglesey is a gentle island, its landscape agricultural and unhurried, its fields divided by hedgerows and low stone walls, its villages sitting in the folds of the land, with the settled confidence of places that have been inhabited for a very long time. In one of those fields, reached by a footpath that winds through farmland, with the kind of informality that suggests the path has simply been walked into existence over many years, there is a passage tomb that archaeologists consider one of the finest and most significant prehistoric monuments in all of Wales. It is called Bryn Celyn Ddu. The name is Welsh and it means the mound in the dark. Grove, a name that captures something essential about the atmosphere of the place, the sense of enclosure and shade and quiet that settles over you when you arrive. The tomb dates to around 3000 BCE, placing it in the Neolithic period, in the same broad era of monument building that produced the great passage tombs of Ireland and the megalithic chambers of Brittany and the cairns of the Scottish Highlands. The people who built Bryn Celli Dhu were farmers, settled on the fertile soils of Anglesey, living in a landscape they had already significantly shaped through clearance and cultivation. They understood their island with the deep familiarity that comes from generations of working the same ground. What makes Bryn Celli Dhu particularly remarkable among the many Neolithic monuments of Britain and Ireland is its layered history. The fact that it was built not on empty ground but on top of an earlier monument of a completely different type. Beneath the passage tomb, archaeologists have discovered the remains of a henge, a circular earthwork enclosure surrounded by a ditch, with a ring of standing stones inside it, and evidence of ritual activity including a pit containing a human ear bone and fragments of burnt bone and charcoal. The henge at Bryn Celli Dhu appears to have been deliberately dismantled before the passage tomb was constructed over it. The standing stones were removed or buried, the ditch was partially filled, and a new and different kind of monument was built in its place. This sequence of deliberate replacement, one sacred form giving way to another, the new monument built consciously over the remains of the old, speaks of a community working through changes in its religious or cosmological understanding, marking those changes in the most permanent way available to it. The passage tomb that replaced the henge follows the classic form, a stone-lined corridor leading inward from the entrance to a roughly polygonal chamber at the heart of the mound, the whole structure covered by a circular cairn of stones and earth, retained by a curb of upright slabs around its perimeter. The mound is not large by the standards of the great Irish passage tombs, but its proportions are carefully considered, and the quality of the stonework in the passage and chamber is fine and precise. The orientation of the passage is toward the midsummer sunrise. On the morning of the summer solstice, the rising sun sends its light directly down the passage of Bryn Celli Dhu and illuminates the chamber within. The same principle of solar alignment found at the mound of the hostages at Tara and at Newgrange in County Meath, but here aligned to the solstice of summer rather than winter, to the longest day rather than the shortest. Inside the chamber there is a standing stone, a smooth, rounded pillar of local stone that rises from the floor to nearly shoulder height, positioned near the back wall with a presence that is immediately and quietly commanding. Its purpose is unknown. It bears no carvings, no visible markings of any kind. It is simply there, in the dark interior of the chamber, in the same position it has occupied for 5,000 years, holding whatever significance its makers gave it in a silence that has never been broken by explanation. Outside the tomb, beside the mound, there is a replica of a carved stone that was found during excavations in the early 20th century, and removed to the National Museum of Wales for preservation. The original stone bears a complex pattern of spirals and curves, abstract flowing, deeply carved into the surface with a skill and an intention that speaks of a tradition of sacred art connected to similar carvings found at the great Irish passage tombs. The pattern on the stone has no obvious representational content, no figures or faces or recognizable forms. It is pure geometry, pure rhythm, the kind of mark that suggests a mind navigating the relationship between order and organic form in a way that is aesthetic and meaningful simultaneously. Anglesey has always been an island of particular sacred significance in the Welsh and broader Celtic tradition. It was the last stronghold of the Druids, the priestly class of Iron Age Celtic society, when the Roman general Suetonius Paulinus led his legions across the Menai Strait in 60 CE and destroyed the sacred groves that the Romans understood to be the spiritual heart of British resistance. The island had been accumulating sacred meaning for millennia before the Druids made it their center, and Bryn Celli Dhu is one of the oldest and most tangible expressions of that accumulated significance. There is a continuity here, not unbroken, not simple, but real. between the Neolithic farmers who dismantled their henge and built their passage tomb on this particular piece of Anglesey ground, and the Iron Age druids who regarded the same island as the most sacred place in their world, and the Welsh-speaking farming families who maintained the footpath to the tomb across the centuries and gave it the name it still carries, and the people who come here today and stand at the entrance to the passage in the early morning and feel, in some way that bypasses analysis, that they are in a place that has been known and valued and returned to for a very long time. Walk down the passage of Bryn Gellidu slowly, letting your eyes adjust to the dimness, feeling the stone walls close around you as the light from the entrance diminishes behind you. The chamber opens at the end, small, cool, absolutely quiet. The standing stone is there in the near dark, patient and smooth and present. Outside, the Anglesey fields are green and wide and the summer sky is enormous. But in here, in the dark grove that the name remembers, it is still and ancient and entirely itself. Dun Angus. There is a cliff on the western edge of Innismore, the largest of the Aran Islands off the coast of County Galway in Ireland, that drops 90 meters straight into the Atlantic Ocean. No slope, no beach, no gradual transition between land and sea, just the limestone plateau of the island, and then, without warning or ceremony, nothing. The ocean below is always moving, always loud, sending spray upward in white bursts when the Atlantic swell is running, and the wind at the cliff edge is a constant presence, pressing against you with a physical insistence that makes you instinctively step back from the edge, even when you intended to stand firm. On this cliff, with its back to the Atlantic and its face looking inland across the island, there is a stone fortress of extraordinary age and extraordinary drama. It is called Dun Angus, and it is, by almost any measure, one of the most spectacularly positioned prehistoric monuments anywhere in the world. The fort dates to the Bronze and Iron Ages, with occupation and construction spanning a period from roughly 1100 BCE through the early medieval period. It was not built all at once. The structures visible today represent multiple phases of construction, each generation adding to and reinforcing what had come before, the whole complex growing over centuries into the form that survives now. The plan of Dun Angus is a D shape, or rather, it would be a complete circle if the cliff behind it had not removed the other half. The fort uses the cliff itself as its most formidable defensive feature, the sheer drop of the Atlantic serving as a wall that no human engineering could improve upon. The remaining semicircle of the landward side is defended by 3 concentric walls of dry stone masonry, each one thick and carefully built, the innermost wall enclosing the central space where the most important activities of the settlement would have taken place. Between the middle and outer walls lies one of the most remarkable defensive features of prehistoric Ireland, the chevaux de frise. This is a dense field of sharp limestone slabs, set upright in the ground at irregular angles, their points projecting outward, covering an area that any attacker would have to cross to reach the walls beyond. The slabs vary in height and spacing, some of them knee-high, others reaching to the waist, none of them spaced in a way that allows easy passage. Moving through this field at speed, in the chaos of an assault, would have been extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The chevaux de frise at Dun Angus is one of the finest examples of this defensive technique surviving anywhere in prehistoric Europe. It speaks of a community that thought carefully about how an attack would unfold and engineered their defenses accordingly. Not just walls to stop people, but obstacles to slow and disorder them, to break the momentum of an assault before it even reached the stone. Stand at the edge of the chevaux de frise and look toward the inner wall, and you feel the layered logic of the defense. The stones at your feet, the wall beyond them, and behind the wall the cliff, the final and absolute boundary. There was nowhere to retreat from Dun Angus except into the sea. The people who sheltered here understood that, and they built their defenses to ensure that retreat was never necessary. The interior of the innermost enclosure is a wide open space of flat limestone pavement, the rock worn smooth by weather and by the feet of the people who lived and gathered here across many centuries. There are no substantial structural remains within the inner enclosure. No walls of buildings, no hearths, no evidence of permanent domestic occupation in the way that other prehistoric forts have produced. This absence has led researchers to suggest that the inner enclosure of Dun Angus may have served a primarily ceremonial function, a gathering space for significant community events rather than an everyday living area. The cliff behind the inner enclosure is always there, always audible in the sound of the sea below, always felt in the wind that comes off the Atlantic without interruption from any landmass between here and the coast of North America. Sitting in the inner enclosure, with your back to the cliff, the interior of the island spread before you, and the three concentric walls stepping outward toward the horizon, you feel both protected and exposed in equal measure. The walls hold you. The cliff behind you reminds you of the scale of what lies beyond. The name Dun Angus connects the fort to Angus, a mythological king of the Firbolg, one of the legendary peoples said in medieval Irish tradition to have inhabited Ireland before the coming of the Tuatha De Danann. Whether any historical reality underlies this mythological connection is impossible to determine. What the name tells us is that by the time the medieval Irish were writing down their traditions and their histories, Dun Angus was already old enough to belong to myth rather than memory, already so ancient that it required a legendary explanation. The Aran Islands themselves occupy a place in the Irish imagination that goes beyond the merely geographical. These limestone islands at the mouth of Galway Bay, their fields divided by thousands of kilometers of dry stone walls built from the rock that was cleared to make farming possible, their communities speaking Irish as a first language well into the modern era, have long been understood as a place where something essential and old about Irish culture was preserved against the changes that swept through the mainland. Dun Angus is the oldest and most powerful expression of that sense of preservation. It has been here through everything, through the coming of Christianity, through the Viking raids, through the Norman invasion, through the long centuries of colonial disruption, through the famine, through the 20th century and into this one. The Atlantic has been wearing at the cliff beneath it all that time, slowly taking the limestone away, and one day the cliff will have retreated far enough that the inner wall of the fort will stand at the very edge and then fall. But that day is far off, and for now the fort stands where it has always stood, looking inland across its island with the sea at its back. Go there in the late afternoon when the light is coming from the west and the Atlantic is gold and enormous behind you, and sit in the inner enclosure and let the wind and the sound of the waves below fill the silence. There is nothing between you and the oldest Ireland from that particular place on that particular cliff. Nothing at all but stone and sky and the endlessly patient sea. Marcahuasi stone formations. There is a plateau in the Andes Mountains of central Peru, sitting at an altitude of roughly 4,000 meters above sea level, that most people will never visit, and that those who have visited tend to describe in ways that make it sound like something between a geological phenomenon and a dream. The air up here is thin and cold and extraordinarily clear, the kind of clarity that makes distant things look closer than they are, and that gives the light a quality, sharp, unmediated, arriving without the softening that lower altitudes provide, that changes the way everything looks. The plateau is called Marcahuasi. It sits above the village of San Pedro de Costa in the Lima region, reached by a climb that takes several hours from the valley below, and that deposits the traveler, breathless and slightly altered by the altitude, onto a flat expanse of high moorland, dotted with extraordinary rock formations that the wind and rain and freeze-thaw cycles of countless Andean winters have carved from the granite of the plateau over millions of years. These formations are the subject of this chapter, and they are unlike almost anything else on Earth. The rocks of Marcahuasi are granite, hard, resistant, slow to erode, the kind of stone that holds its shape across geological time scales, while softer rocks around it wear away. But the specific combination of forces that has acted on the Marcahuasi granite over millions of years has produced something that simple erosion rarely produces with such consistency. Forms that look, with a persistence that goes beyond casual resemblance, like faces and figures and animals and human profiles. There is a formation that resembles, from certain angles and in certain lights, a human face of monumental proportions, broad-featured, serene, looking out across the plateau with an expression that changes depending on the time of day and the angle of the sun. There are rocks that read as animals. A seal? A camel? A frog? Creatures that have no business being carved into an Andean mountainside by any natural process. And yet, here they are, shaped by wind and water and time into forms that the human eye cannot help but recognize. The human brain is extraordinarily good at finding faces and figures in random shapes. It is a cognitive tendency so deeply wired into our perception that it has its own name, pareidolia, and its own evolutionary logic. But Marca Huasi tests the easy application of that explanation. The resemblances here are too consistent, too numerous, too geometrically precise in some cases to be entirely dismissed as the projection of pattern-seeking minds onto neutral stone. The question of whether the formations at Marca Huasi are entirely natural or whether some of them were shaped or modified by human hands is one that researchers have debated for decades without reaching a definitive consensus. The debate was sharpened considerably in the mid-20th century by a Peruvian scholar named Daniel Russo, who spent years studying the plateau and became convinced that many of the formations were the deliberate work of an ancient and otherwise unknown civilization, a culture he called the Mazma, which he believed had preceded the Inca and all other known Andean cultures by thousands of years. Russo's theories were controversial in his own time and remain so. Mainstream archaeology does not recognize the Mazma civilization as a historical reality, and the mechanisms Russo proposed for the creation and modification of the rock forms have not survived scientific scrutiny. But his passion for the plateau and his detailed documentation of its formations, the photographs, the measurements, the careful records of which formations are visible only at specific times of year and specific times of day, created a body of work that subsequent researchers have drawn on even as they have questioned his conclusions. What is not in dispute is the relationship between Marca Huasi and the indigenous communities of the region. The Andean peoples who have lived in the villages and valleys around this plateau for centuries have always known about it, always regarded it as a place of power and significance. In the Andean cosmological tradition, high places, the mountain peaks and the high plateaus, the places where the earth reaches toward the sky, are understood as huacas, sacred sites, where the boundary between the human world and the world of the divine is thin and permeable. Marca Huasi, with its strange and watchful stone figures, its thin air and its extraordinary light, its position above the clouds on days when the valley below is obscured by weather, fits the definition of a huasa with an almost uncomfortable precision. It feels like a place where normal rules are suspended, where the usual relationship between the human observer and the observed landscape has been quietly reversed and the rocks are watching you as much as you are watching them. Ceremonies have been held on this plateau across generations, offerings made to the earth, to the mountain, to the figures in the stone. The local festival held annually at Marca Huasi draws participants from the surrounding communities who climb to the plateau to dance and make offerings in a tradition that connects the living to their ancestors and to the sacred geography of their homeland. The practical conditions of Marca Huasi shape the experience of the place profoundly. At 4,000 meters, the body works harder than it does at lower altitudes. The heart beats faster, the breath comes quicker, the mind moves with a slight but perceptible slowness that the altitude imposes regardless of physical fitness. This physiological alteration is itself part of the experience of high sacred places in the Andean tradition. The difficulty of reaching them, the physical demand they make on the body, is understood as part of the process of arrival. You earn the plateau, and in earning it, you are changed by the effort in ways that make you more receptive to what the place has to offer. The light at Marca Huasi changes everything. In the middle of the day, when the sun is directly overhead and the shadows are short, many of the figurative formations flatten out and become harder to read. The faces dissolve back into abstract rock. The animals become simple boulders. But in the early morning and the late afternoon, when the sun is low and the shadows are long and raking, the formations come alive in ways that justify every superlative that visitors have applied to them. What Markawasi ultimately offers is something that very few places in the world can provide in quite this combination: extreme natural beauty, genuine geological strangeness, a deep layering of human meaning and ceremonial history, and an altitude that strips away the ordinary mental noise of lower elevations and leaves you quietly alone with the rocks and the sky and whatever it is you brought up the mountain with you. The formations will be here long after the current chapter of human civilization has passed. The granite of the Andes does not hurry. The faces in the stone have been watching the plateau for longer than our species has been capable of recognizing them as faces, and they will continue watching long after the last pilgrim has made the climb and stood breathless on the high moorland and looked into the stone eyes of Markawasi and felt, in some wordless and immediate way, that something was looking back. Rest now. Let the thin Andean air settle around you. Let the stone faces hold their ancient watch through the long, quiet night. The beehive tomb of Atreus. There is a hillside on the outskirts of the ancient city of Mycenae, in the northeastern Peloponnese of Greece, where the land rises in a long, steady slope toward the fortress walls that crown the ridge above. The landscape here is dry and golden in the summer months, the scrub vegetation clinging to the rocky soil with the particular tenacity of plants that have learned to survive on very little. The mountains behind Mycenae are bare and dramatic. The plain below opens toward the sea in the far distance, blue and faint on clear days, a reminder that this civilization was always, in some essential way, oriented toward the water, on that hillside, set into the slope, so that its entrance faces east and its great domed chamber is buried entirely within the earth. There is a tomb that has no equal in the Bronze Age world. It is called the Treasury of Atreus, though it has nothing to do with treasure and the connection to Atreus, the mythological king, whose family curse drives the tragedies of ancient Greek drama, is a later invention, a story attached to an impressive ruin by people who came after and needed a name for something whose true origins they had already forgotten. Its real name in the language of archaeology is a Tholos tomb, and it is the finest example of that form ever built. The tomb dates to around 1250 BCE, placing it at the height of Mycenaean civilization, that Bronze Age culture of palace economies and warrior kings and long-distance maritime trade that Homer's epics would later remember and transform into myth. The Mycenaeans were sophisticated builders and ambitious ones, and the Treasury of Atreus represents the fullest expression of their architectural ambition in the service of death and memory. You approach it through a long dromos, an open-air corridor cut into the hillside, its walls rising on either side as you walk inward, the stone courses climbing higher with each step until by the time you reach the entrance you are walking through a canyon of carefully fitted masonry several meters tall. The dromos is nearly 35 meters long and 6 meters wide, and walking its length is itself a ceremonial experience, a transition between the ordinary world outside and the extraordinary space within. The doorway at the end of the dromos is massive, over 5 meters tall, nearly 3 meters wide, framed by half columns of carved stone that were once decorated with zigzag and spiral patterns in green and red stone, fragments of which survive to give a suggestion of the original richness of the entrance decoration. Above the doorway, a triangular opening, the relieving triangle, distributes the weight of the masonry above and prevents the lintel from being crushed. The lintel itself consists of 2 enormous stone beams, the inner one estimated to weigh over 100 tons. Step through that doorway, and the space that opens before you is one of the great interior experiences of the ancient world. The chamber is circular, roughly 14.5 meters in diameter, and its walls rise in a corbelled dome, each course of stone projecting slightly inward from the one below, the circles growing smaller and smaller as they ascend until they meet at a single capstone nearly 13 meters above the floor. The geometry of this space was not arrived at casually. The dome of the treasury of Atreus was, at the time of its construction, the largest domed space in the world, a record it held for over 1,000 years, until the Pantheon in Rome superseded it. The builders understood the physics of corbelling with an intuitive precision that allowed them to stack course upon course of heavy stone in a progressively narrowing spiral without the structure collapsing inward. Stand at the center of the chamber floor and look up. The dome rises above you in its perfect curve. The stone surfaces slightly rough where the bronze rosettes that once decorated them have long since been removed or fallen away, the proportions so carefully calculated that the space feels neither oppressive nor empty, but exactly, mysteriously right. There is an acoustic quality to the chamber as well. Sound behaves differently here than it does outside, gathering and reflecting in ways that would have given ritual utterances and laments a resonance that the open air could never have produced. A smaller rectangular chamber opens off the main room to one side. This is where the actual burial would have taken place, the body of the Mycenaean ruler for whom this vast structure was built, laid with the grave goods appropriate to his status. Gold death masks, bronze weapons, inlaid daggers, amber beads, ivory carvings. These are the kinds of objects recovered from other Mycenaean shaft, graves, and thalos tombs. The material expression of a culture that believed the dead needed to be equipped for whatever came after in a manner befitting their earthly rank. The identity of the person buried here is unknown. Atreus is a myth. The actual king whose workers cut this hillside and fitted these stones and raised this impossible dome is nameless to us now. His memory outlasted by the monument his ambition created. That anonymity feels appropriate somehow. The treasury of Atreus has long since transcended any individual story. It belongs now to the longer human story, the one about the desire to make something permanent, to push against the fact of death with the counterfact of stone and geometry and the patient accumulation of skill. The tomb was robbed in antiquity, its contents removed by people who came after the collapse of Mycenaean civilization and found this great domed chamber empty of the culture that had given it meaning but full of the material wealth that culture had placed within it. What they took is gone. What they could not take, the dome, the dromos, the vast fitted stones of the entrance, remains exactly where the builders of 1250 BCE placed it. Walk back out through the doorway and along the dromos toward the light. The hillside of Mycenae is warm around you. The plain below is gold and distant. And behind you the great dome holds its chamber in the cool dark of the hill, patient and permanent, keeping the memory of a name it was never given, and a king it will never be able to name, in the only language it has always known, the language of stone and silence and the refusal to disappear. Chaco Canyon. There is a canyon in the high desert of northwestern New Mexico where the silence has a different quality than silence anywhere else. It is not the silence of absence. There is wind here, and the occasional cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the canyon walls, and the sound of your own footsteps on the pale desert earth. But beneath all of that, there is a deeper silence, the silence of a place that was once extraordinarily full of human life, and is now extraordinarily empty of it. And that contrast gives the quiet here a weight and a resonance that settles into you slowly as you walk. Chaco Canyon. The name is simple and the place is not. For roughly 3 centuries between about 850 and 1150 CE, this remote and apparently inhospitable stretch of high desert in what is now the American Southwest was the center of one of the most complex and sophisticated cultures in pre-Columbian North America. The people we call the ancestral Puebloans built here on a scale and with a precision that still astonishes, and then they left, and the canyon has held their buildings in its dry air ever since with a preserving care that the desert climate is uniquely suited to provide. The canyon itself is not dramatic in the way of the Grand Canyon or the Red Rock country of southern Utah. It is wide and relatively shallow, its walls rising perhaps 100 meters above the sandy floor. The rock pale sandstone that shifts color across the day from cream in the morning light to deep amber in the late afternoon. The vegetation is sparse, scrubby sage and desert grasses, scattered juniper trees that manage to find enough moisture in the canyon substrate to survive and grow slowly over many decades. What fills this austere landscape with meaning is what the ancestral Puebloans built within it. The great houses, the massive multi-storied stone buildings that archaeologists call great houses, are the most visible expression of the Chacoan achievement. Pueblo is Bonito, the largest and most studied of them, contains somewhere between 600 and 800 rooms arranged in a great D-shaped plan, its back wall running straight along the canyon cliff, and its curved front enclosing a series of circular ceremonial chambers called kivas. At its greatest extent, it may have stood 4 or 5 stories tall, its sandstone masonry cut and fitted with a precision and artistry that the best modern masons regard with genuine professional admiration. The masonry at Chaco is worth slowing down to consider. The Chacans developed several distinct styles of stonework over the centuries of their occupation, each one more refined than the last, each one representing an accumulation of skill and knowledge passed between generations of builders. The finest style, what archaeologists sometimes call Type 4 masonry, involves the careful selection and shaping of thin sandstone tablets, laid in courses with a precision that creates a surface almost mosaic-like in its regularity, banded with alternating layers of larger and smaller stones in a pattern that is both structurally sound and visually beautiful. These walls were not left exposed. They were plastered inside and out, the plaster sometimes painted with geometric designs in the colors available from local mineral pigments, red and white, and the deep black of charred wood. The rooms within the great houses would have been warm and intimate spaces, low-ceilinged and firelit, smelling of wood smoke and the pine and juniper that the Chacoans brought from forests many kilometers away because the canyon itself could not supply the timber their buildings required. The timber question opens onto one of the most remarkable aspects of the Chacoan world, the road system. The Chacoans built roads, not paths worn gradually into the earth by repeated use, but engineered roads, deliberately constructed, cut into the desert surface and in some places edged with low stone berms, running in straight lines across the landscape with a directness that ignores topography, climbing steep slopes by means of cut steps rather than detouring around obstacles. These roads connected Chaco Canyon to a network of outlying communities spread across a vast territory, dozens of smaller settlements that shared the architectural vocabulary and the ceramic styles of the canyon center, and that participated in whatever system of exchange and ceremony and political organization the Chacoan world represented. The roads were wide, often 9 meters or more, far wider than practical foot traffic would require. They were statements as much as infrastructure, expressions of the reach and the ambition of a culture that understood its landscape on a regional scale. Walking one of these roads in your imagination, out across the high desert, away from the canyon, you feel the Chacoan world expand around you. This was not a local phenomenon, not a community turned inward on itself. This was a center, drawing people and goods and ideas from a wide surrounding territory, sending its influence outward along those straight desert roads to communities that looked to Chaco as something, a sacred center, a political authority, a ceremonial hub, whose precise nature we are still working to understand. The kivas are the structures that speak most directly of the ceremonial life that was clearly central to the Chacoan world. These circular, semi-subterranean chambers were the spaces where the community's ritual life unfolded, where dances were performed, where the connections between the living and the ancestral spirits were maintained, where the knowledge that held the community together was transmitted from one generation to the next in the form of ceremony and story and song. The great kivas at Chaco, larger versions of the standard form, big enough to hold substantial gatherings of people, are among the most impressive spaces in all of prehistoric North America. Descending into one, even in its roofless and ruined state, you feel the deliberateness of the enclosure. The way the circular form and the partially subterranean position create a sense of being held by the earth, contained and focused in a way that the open desert outside does not permit. There is a sipapu in many kivas, a small hole in the floor that represents the opening through which the first people emerged from the underworld in Puebloan cosmology. It is the smallest and most quietly significant feature of the space, and it grounds the entire structure in a vision of the world in which the ground beneath your feet is not a boundary but a threshold. The question of why the Chacones left, why this remarkable flowering of architecture and ceremony and regional organization came to an end in the mid-12th century, does not have a simple answer. A prolonged drought, documented in the tree ring record of the region, certainly played a role. The canyon was always a marginal environment for the agriculture that supported its population, depended on careful water management and on the surplus production of the outlying communities connected by those great roads. When the rains failed consistently across decades, the margin disappeared. But drought alone may not account for the full story. There are signs in the archaeological record of social stress, of changes in the patterns of ritual activity, of a gradual dispersal rather than a sudden abandonment. The people did not vanish. They moved, carrying with them the knowledge and the traditions and the deep cosmological understanding that had shaped the Chacuan world. And they built again elsewhere. And their descendants are the Pueblo peoples of the American Southwest today. The canyon received them back into its silence. The great houses settled slowly into the desert, their roofs collapsing inward, their plaster weathering away, their rooms filling with the fine wind-blown sand that the desert produces in patient and inexhaustible supply. And the dry air of the high desert preserved what remained with a fidelity that wetter climates could never have managed. Thornborough Henges. There is a place in North Yorkshire, in the broad and gentle vale that lies between the rivers Ure and Swale, where the landscape opens out into a flatness that feels almost deliberate, as though the land itself had decided to make room for something. The fields here are wide and the sky above them is wide, and the horizon sits at a distance that gives the eye nowhere particular to rest, nowhere to stop, so that your attention eventually settles on the middle ground, on the immediate texture of the earth beneath your feet and the slow movements of light across the grass. It is in this particular quality of open, unhurried landscape that three of the most significant and least visited prehistoric monuments in all of Britain sit in their quiet alignment, one after another, spaced along a stretch of ground that runs roughly north to south for nearly 2 kilometers. These are the Thornborough Henges, three enormous circular earthworks, each one nearly 250 meters in diameter, built sometime around 3,500 to 2,500 BCE by Neolithic and early Bronze Age communities whose names we do not know, and whose spoken language is entirely lost to us. What they left behind, however, is anything but lost. It is right there in the earth of North Yorkshire, patient and enormous, waiting for whoever comes looking. A henge, in the archaeological sense, is a specific type of monument, a roughly circular area enclosed by a bank and an internal ditch. This arrangement, bank outside and ditch inside, is the reverse of what you would expect from a purely defensive structure, and that reversal tells us something important. Henges were not built for defense. They were built to define a space, to create an enclosure that was different from the world outside it, where different things could happen and different rules could apply. The Thornborough Henges are among the largest henges ever constructed in Britain. Each one required the movement of enormous quantities of earth. The bank of each henge stands several meters high even today. After millennia of weathering and settling, and in their original condition they would have been taller and more sharply defined, visible from a considerable distance across the flat vale. Building them was a massive collective undertaking, requiring the coordinated labor of a large community over an extended period of time. And then there are three of them, aligned in a row, their centers spaced at intervals of roughly 550 meters, the whole arrangement oriented in a way that has led some researchers to suggest a deliberate connection with the belt of Orion, the three stars that form the most recognizable feature of that constellation, spaced in a similar pattern, visible in the winter sky above this part of Yorkshire with particular clarity on clear nights. Whether the Orion connection was intentional is a question that archaeology cannot definitively answer. What is clear is that the alignment of the three henges was deliberate. They are too precisely spaced and too consistently oriented for their arrangement to be accidental, and that the people who planned and built them were working within a cosmological framework that gave the sky and its patterns a profound significance in the organization of the sacred landscape below it. This connection between earth and sky runs through the prehistoric monument tradition of Britain and Ireland like a thread. The builders of these great earthworks were not simply marking territory or creating gathering spaces in a purely practical sense. They were making the landscape correspond to something larger, to the movements of the sun and moon and stars, to a vision of the cosmos in which the world below was a reflection or an echo of the world above. Standing inside one of the Thornborough Henges and looking up at the night sky as the people who built it might have looked up, you feel something of the intention behind the structure. The circular bank encloses a circle of sky above you. The henge frames the heavens the way a window frames a view, giving them a boundary, a context, a relationship to the human scale of the person standing at the center looking upward. The three henges were not built simultaneously. The archaeological evidence suggests a sequence of construction spread across centuries, with the central henge possibly predating the northern and southern ones. This means the monument as we understand it today, three aligned circles, was itself a project that unfolded over a long span of time, each generation adding to or completing what the previous one had begun or envisioned. There is something deeply human in that multi-generational ambition. The people who laid out the central henge could not have known exactly what the finished alignment would look like when all three were complete. They were trusting something, a tradition, a vision, a set of instructions passed down through the community that extended beyond their own lifetimes. They were building toward a completion they would never see. The surface of the henge banks was coated with gypsum, a white crystalline mineral that would have made the earthworks gleam in sunlight and shimmer in moonlight, visible across the flat vale from a great distance. This is not the choice of people building something purely functional. This is the choice of people who wanted their monument to be beautiful, who understood that beauty and meaning were not separate things, but expressions of the same underlying intention. The area around Thornborough was not empty of other monuments. The wider landscape contains evidence of extensive prehistoric activity, cursus monuments, which are long parallel-sided earthwork enclosures whose purpose remains uncertain but whose construction required enormous effort, as well as burial mounds, standing stones, and the traces of settlements that surrounded and served the ceremonial complex at the henges. Thornborough was not a monument in isolation. It was the center of a sacred landscape, the most prominent expression of a whole geography of meaning that extended across the Vale of Mowbray. The river Ure, which runs near the site, would have provided both a practical resource and a symbolic boundary. Water in prehistoric cosmology frequently marked the edge of one world and the beginning of another, the threshold between the familiar and the sacred. Arriving at Thornborough by river, approaching the gleaming white banks of the henges across the flat valley floor, would have been an experience carefully orchestrated by the landscape and the monuments together. Today, the Thornborough Henges are a scheduled ancient monument, protected by law but not always easy to find or to access. They sit in farmland, their banks still clearly visible, but their surfaces worn and grass-covered. The gypsum coating long since weathered away. They do not announce themselves dramatically. You have to look for them, and when you find them, they ask you to slow down and give them time. That slowness is appropriate. These are monuments built on a time scale that the modern world finds difficult to comprehend. Conceived across generations, constructed over centuries, used and revisited and maintained across a span of time that dwarfs the entire recorded history of the nation that now contains them. Stand on the bank of one of the Thornborough Henges on a clear winter evening, when the sky above the Vale of Mowbray is dark and sharp with stars, and look for Orion rising in the east. The 3 stars of the belt will be there, as they always are, spaced in their familiar pattern above the flat Yorkshire horizon. And below them, in the earth of the vale, the 3 great circles will be there too, patient, enormous, and still, after 5,000 years, keeping their alignment. Tralleis, sacred complex. There is a city in western Turkey, modern and busy and alive, with the ordinary rhythms of contemporary life, that sits on top of something ancient. The city is called Aydin today, and it occupies a fertile valley in the Buke-Menderes river basin where the land is generous and the climate is warm and the soil has been producing grain and olives and figs for longer than written records can account for. It is a pleasant place, in the way that places with deep roots and productive land tend to be pleasant, settled, unhurried, sure of itself. And on a broad plateau above this valley, where the ground rises and levels into a natural terrace commanding views across the surrounding landscape in almost every direction, the ancient city of Tralleis once stood. Not a village, not a minor settlement, but a genuine city, prosperous, cosmopolitan, connected to the wider Greek and later Roman world through trade and culture, and the kind of intellectual life that flourishes when a place has enough wealth and enough stability to support it. The sacred complex at Tralleis was the heart of that city in a way that went beyond the merely religious. It was a place where the community understood itself, where its relationship with the divine was made physical and permanent, in stone and column and carefully oriented space. Tralleis has ancient roots that reach back well before the classical period. The site was inhabited during the Bronze Age, and its position on that commanding plateau, defensible, well-watered, overlooking a valley of exceptional agricultural richness, made it a natural choice for settlement across many successive cultures. Lydians, Persians, Macedonians, and eventually Romans all left their mark on this city, each layer of occupation adding to and reshaping what had come before. But it was during the Hellenistic and Roman periods that Tralleis reached its greatest prosperity and its most impressive architectural expression. The city became known across the ancient world for its wealth, for the quality of its civic buildings, and for the athletes and scholars it produced. The geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century BCE, described Tralleis as one of the most prosperous cities in all of Asia Minor. High praise from a writer who knew that landscape intimately and was not given to easy flattery. The sacred complex occupied the highest and most prominent part of the plateau, as was customary in the Greek and Roman urban tradition. To build a temple was to mark a place as significant, and to build it on high ground was to make that significance visible from a distance, to let the columns and the roofline speak to the surrounding landscape about the presence and the power of the divine. The temple at the heart of the Tralleis sacred complex was dedicated, in its classical form, to Zeus, the father of the Olympian gods, the ruler of sky and thunder, the deity whose authority over the divine order mirrored the authority of earthly rulers over human communities. Dedicating your city's primary temple to Zeus was a statement of civic ambition and of alignment with the dominant religious and political culture of the Hellenistic world. The temple was built in the Corinthian order, the most elaborate and ornate of the 3 classical orders, characterized by its capitals decorated with carved acanthus leaves, their curling fronds reaching upward from the column top with an energy that seems almost botanical, almost alive. Corinthian columns speak of wealth and sophistication, of a community confident enough in its prosperity to invest in beauty beyond what mere function requires. Only 3 columns of this temple survive standing today, rising from the plateau at Aden with a solitude that is more eloquent than ruin. They are tall, dramatically, unexpectedly tall, when you encounter them for the first time, and they stand against the Turkish sky with the kind of quiet authority that comes from having been vertical for 2,000 years, while everything around them has fallen and been rebuilt and fallen again. 3 columns. But those 3 columns are enough to give you the scale of the original structure, to let your imagination reconstruct the full colonnade, the row upon row of those tall Corinthian shafts, the decorated entablature above them, the pitched roof with its terracotta tiles, the cult statue within the inner chamber glowing in the lamplight. Enough to understand why travelers in antiquity listed Tralleis among the cities worth visiting, worth writing about, worth remembering. The sacred complex extended beyond the temple itself. Like most major sanctuaries of the Hellenistic and Roman world, it was a precinct, a defined and consecrated area within which multiple structures coexisted. There would have been an altar placed in the open air to the east of the temple, where the sacrifices and the primary ritual acts took place in full view of the assembled community. There would have been stoas, the long colonnaded porches that Greek civic design used to create sheltered walkways and gathering spaces, and perhaps smaller shrines and votive monuments dedicated by wealthy citizens or by the city itself in gratitude for victories or in appeal for divine favor. The precinct was enclosed, marked off from the surrounding city by a boundary that was partly physical and partly conceptual. The temenos, the sacred ground within which different rules applied, where the ordinary calculations of daily life gave way to the older, slower logic of the divine. Tralleis suffered greatly from earthquakes, as so many cities of western Anatolia have throughout history. The region sits on a complex of fault lines that runs through the Aegean and the Anatolian plateau, and the geological instability that has always characterized this landscape has periodically expressed itself in destruction that no amount of human skill or divine favor could prevent. Major earthquakes struck Tralleis in antiquity, and each time the city rebuilt, a testament to the tenacity of a community that had too much invested in its plateau to abandon it simply because the earth had shaken. The rebuilding each time incorporated the new architectural fashions and the new technologies of the era, so that the sacred complex as it stood in the full Roman imperial period was a layered thing, ancient in its foundations and its orientation, more recent in its superstructure, carrying within its fabric the accumulated decisions of centuries of worship and repair and renewal. What draws people to the 3 standing columns of Tralleis today is not only their height or their elegance, though both are real. It is the feeling they produce of being in the presence of something that has endured against the reasonable expectation of ruin. Earthquakes, wars, the systematic removal of dressed stone for later building projects, the long centuries of neglect, all of these forces worked against these columns, and still they stand. There is a lesson in that persistence, though it is not a lesson that needs to be stated directly. It arrives on its own, quietly, as you stand on the plateau above the Büyük Menderes Valley and look up at the Acanthus capitals against the open sky and feel the warm Aegean wind moving across the high ground. Some things, built with enough care and placed with enough intention, simply refuse to entirely disappear. They remain partial, weathered, changed by time, but present. Still pointing upward. Still marking the place where people once came together to address themselves to something larger than their own brief lives, in the hope that it was listening. Carnac alignment satellites. There is a stretch of land in the Brittany region of northwestern France where the earth itself seems to have made a decision about stone. Everywhere you look, stone rises from the ground, not in the dramatic cliff-faced way of coastal geology, but in a quieter, more deliberate way, as though the land and the people who lived on it long ago reached some agreement about what stone was for and how it ought to be arranged. The Carnac alignments are the most famous expression of that agreement. Thousands of standing stones arranged in long parallel rows that march across the landscape for several kilometers have drawn visitors and scholars for centuries. But around the main alignments, scattered across the broader Morbihan landscape in patterns that reveal themselves slowly. There are satellite monuments, smaller groupings of standing stones, dolmens, and enclosures that belong to the same vast prehistoric project but have never received quite the same attention as their more famous neighbors. These satellites reward careful attention generously. The people who raised these stones were Neolithic farmers, living in this Atlantic corner of Europe, somewhere between 4,500 and 2000 BCE. They were settled, organized, skilled in agriculture and animal husbandry, capable of producing the surplus of food and labor that monumental construction requires. The broader Carnac landscape contains somewhere in the region of 3,000 standing stones when the satellites and outliers are counted alongside the main alignments. 3,000 stones raised by human hands positioned with intention across the territory stretching many kilometers. The scale of the collective enterprise, understood whole, is almost difficult to hold in the mind. Each satellite monument had its own identity and function, even as it participated in the larger pattern. Some were burial monuments, the long mounds and chamber tombs the French call dolmens, where the dead were placed in collective chambers built from massive upright stones roofed with a single great capstone. Others were enclosures, horseshoe or circular arrangements of standing stones that served ceremonial purposes, gathering spaces where the living came together for rituals whose specific nature we cannot recover, but whose importance is written clearly in the effort that went into creating them. The dolmens of the Carnac satellite zone deserve particular attention. The capstones alone, those single flat slabs of granite that roof the burial chambers, can weigh tens of tons. Moving them, lifting them, placing them precisely on their uprights required not just physical strength but a sophisticated understanding of leverage and counterweight, of how to organize people to apply their force in the right direction at the right moment. Walk toward one of these dolmens across a field of Breton farmland on a gray morning, and the scale of the capstone when you reach it is always slightly more than you expected. It hangs above you, supported on its uprights with a solidity that 5,000 years has done nothing to diminish. You understand immediately that the people who put it there were telling you something about what they were capable of and how seriously they regarded their dead. Among the satellite monuments, the enclosures hold a particular fascination. The enclosure at Lemanio sits at the eastern end of the Curlescan alignment group, a roughly rectangular arrangement of standing stones enclosing a significant area of ground. At its eastern end stands the Géant du Magno, nearly 4 meters tall, one of the largest single standing stones in the entire Carnac region. Standing beside it and looking back across the enclosure toward the alignments beyond, you begin to feel the spatial logic of this landscape. These monuments were not built in isolation. They were built in relationship with one another, oriented and scaled in ways that create a landscape of deliberate meaning rather than a collection of individual objects. The satellite monuments are not lesser achievements. They are the connective tissue of a sacred landscape, the places where the geometry of the great alignments meets the everyday terrain of fields and water and sky. Water mattered deeply here. The Morbihan, whose name in the Breton language means little sea, is a region defined by its relationship with water. The great inland gulf, with its islands and tidal channels, would have been central to the lives of the people who built these monuments. Several satellite monuments are positioned in clear visual relationship with water, sited on rises from which the gulf is visible, or placed near the courses of ancient streams. The tidal rhythms of the Atlantic coast are dramatic and reliable. The water comes and goes with a regularity that Neolithic people would have read as part of the same cosmic order that moved the sun and moon across the sky. The stones were part of that order, fixed, permanent, immovable, the still point against which the turning world could be measured and understood. Today, some satellites stand in open fields, accessible and unhurried. Others lean at angles that speak of centuries without attention. A few have been absorbed into farm boundaries, standing at the edges of agricultural land as though they simply belong there, which, in every sense that matters, they do. The Breton light in early morning is soft and diffuse, filtered through Atlantic air that carries the ocean in every particle. In that light, the stones have a presence that is both ancient and immediate. They are not trying to impress anyone. They gave up that ambition a very long time ago. They are simply there, in the same positions they have occupied since hands now long turned to dust pressed them into the earth of Brittany and stepped back and looked at what the landscape had become. Let the stones be still around you. Let the gray morning light fall on everything equally, and feel how deep the human story goes in this quiet corner of the earth. Balnuaran of Clava. There is a place near Inverness, in the Scottish Highlands, where the river Nairn moves quietly through a landscape of field and woodland, and where the light in the late afternoon falls at an angle that makes everything it touches look as though it belongs to another time. The hills here are not dramatic. They are soft and rounded, covered in the kind of moorland vegetation that shifts color with the seasons, from the brown of winter to the purple of late summer heather, and back again in its own slow cycle. Just outside the village of Culloden, a name most people associate with the last and bloodiest battle fought on British soil, there is a grove of old trees. And beneath those trees, arranged with a care and an intention that becomes more apparent the longer you spend with them, there are 3 large burial cairns and several smaller standing stones that together form one of the most quietly extraordinary prehistoric monuments in all of Scotland. This is Balnuaran of Clava. It is nearly 5,000 years old, and it has been standing in this particular bend of the river valley, in this particular quality of highland light, since long before anyone thought to name the hill above it or the water beside it. The 3 main cairns at Clava are not identical, but they share a family resemblance that tells you immediately they were built by the same tradition, if not the same hands. 2 of them are passage cairns, circular mounds of carefully stacked stone, with a central chamber and a narrow passage leading inward from the southwest. The third is what archaeologists call a ring cairn, a circular wall of stone enclosing an open central area, with no passage and no roofed chamber, its interior open to the sky. Each cairn is surrounded by a ring of standing stones, placed at intervals around the perimeter, like sentinels keeping a respectful distance. These standing stones are graded in height, the tallest ones positioned to the southwest, the direction from which the passages of the passage cairns also open, and the stones diminishing in height as they move around the circle to the northeast. This grading was deliberate, and it points towards something that the builders clearly considered important: the movement of the midwinter sun. At the winter solstice, the setting sun aligns precisely with the passages of the 2 passage cairns at Clava, sending its last light of the shortest day directly down the stone corridors and into the burial chambers within. For a few minutes each year, the interior of the tomb is lit by the dying sun of the solstice, a moment of connection between the world of the living, the world of the dead, and the turning of the year that must have carried enormous significance for the people who engineered it so carefully. The cairns are built from local river stones, rounded, smooth-edged cobbles gathered from the bed and banks of the Nairn, carried to the site and stacked with a patience and a precision that the centuries have not entirely undone. In some sections of the cairn walls, you can still see how the builders alternated larger and smaller stones to create a stable, interlocking structure. In others, the stones have shifted and settled, but the overall form remains clear. A low, broad mound, its edges defined by a curb of larger boulders placed upright in the earth. There is a particular quality to the stonework at Clava that distinguishes it from other prehistoric monuments of the same era. Several of the curb stones and passage walls bear cut marks, small circular depressions pecked into the stone surface, their purpose unknown, their presence deliberate. These are among the simplest and most widespread forms of prehistoric rock art found across northern Europe, and yet for all their simplicity, they carry an unmistakable sense of intention. Someone chose to make these marks. Someone spent time pressing a harder stone against the surface of these cairn stones and working a small hollow into them, one careful stroke at a time. We do not know what the cup marks meant. We may never know. But their presence reminds us that the people who built Clava inhabited a world dense with meaning. A world in which the surfaces of things, stones, walls, the bodies of the dead, were understood to be capable of carrying significance that went beyond the merely physical. The setting of Balnuaran of Clava contributes something essential to the experience of the place that is difficult to describe but impossible to ignore. The old trees that grow among and around the cairns, largely beeches, and other deciduous species, their roots finding the gaps between the ancient stones, give the site an atmosphere of enclosure and intimacy that open moorland monuments do not have. The light filters down through the canopy and fragments. The sound of the river reaches you as a background presence, steady and unhurried. It feels, in short, like a place that has been tended. Not in the sense of formal maintenance, though the site is indeed carefully looked after today, but in a deeper sense, the sense of a place that has been valued continuously, that has never been entirely forgotten or abandoned to the indifference of the surrounding landscape. And indeed, the archaeological evidence suggests that Clava was visited and in some sense active long after its original construction. The monument type found here, now called the Clava cairn tradition, is unique to this region of northeastern Scotland, centered on the valley of the River Nairn and the surrounding area. It represents a local expression of the broader Neolithic and early Bronze Age tradition of megalithic monument building, shaped by the particular landscape and the particular people of this Highland River Valley. There are no dramatic myths attached to Balnuaran of Clava, no medieval legends that gathered around these stones the way they did around Tara or Stonehenge. The place was simply here, in its grove by the river, generation after generation, holding its dead and marking its solstices and receiving the quiet attention of the people who passed it and knew it and understood in some unspoken way that it mattered. That ordinariness, if it can be called ordinary, is itself a kind of testament. The most enduring things are not always the most celebrated. Sometimes what lasts is simply what was built with enough care and enough honesty that the world could find no reason to remove it. Stand among the cairns at Clava on a winter afternoon, when the light is low and the air carries the cold edge of the coming dark, and the stones around you glow faintly with the last warmth of the day. The river murmurs beyond the trees. The standing stones cast their long shadows across the mounded earth. And somewhere in the quiet interior of the passage, cairn beside you, in the dark chamber where the solstice sun will reach in just a few weeks, the air is still and cool and undisturbed, as it has been for nearly 5,000 years. Some places ask nothing of you except your presence. Balnuaran of Clava is one of them. Come here and be still, and let the stones do what stones do best. Hold time gently, without fuss, and keep it safe until someone comes along who needs to feel how deep it goes. The Mound of the Hostages. There is a hill in County Meath, in the soft green interior of Ireland, that has been drawing people toward it for 5,000 years. Not because it is the tallest hill in the landscape. It is not. Not because it commands some dramatic view of sea or mountain. The land around it is gentle and rolling, pastoral in the way that the Irish Midlands are pastoral, quietly beautiful rather than spectacular. People have been drawn to this hill for reasons that go deeper than scenery. The hill is called the Hill of Tara, and on its slopes, half buried in the earth, sealed beneath a low grassy mound that a casual walker might step over without a second thought, there is a passage tomb that archaeologists have named the Mound of the Hostages. It is one of the oldest structures in Ireland, one of the oldest in all of Europe, built somewhere around 3,400 to 3,200 BCE. It is older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramids of Egypt, older than almost every monument that the modern world tends to reach for when it wants an example of ancient human ambition. And yet it sits quietly on its hill, unannounced, covered in grass, as if it has simply decided that patience is enough. The mound itself is not large, roughly 5 meters in diameter, rising only modestly from the surrounding ground. But what lies beneath that modest exterior is a passage tomb of genuine sophistication. A stone-lined corridor leads from the entrance inward to a small burial chamber at the back, the whole structure oriented with careful intention toward the sky and the movement of the sun across it, on the mornings around the cross-quarter days of early November and early February, the ancient festivals the Irish would later call Samhain and Imbolc. The rising sun sends its light directly down the passage of the Mound of the Hostages and illuminates the chamber at its heart. This alignment was not accidental. The people who built this structure understood the movement of the sun across the year with a precision that required long observation and careful calculation. They built their knowledge into the stone, made it permanent, encoded it in the architecture of a tomb so that it would outlast any single human life or memory. The tomb was used as a burial place across a remarkably long span of time. The earliest burials date to the Neolithic period, when the monument was first constructed. But people continued to bring their dead here through the Bronze Age, placing cremated remains and later inhumed burials into the passage and chamber over the course of more than 1,000 years. Archaeologists have recovered the remains of at least 200 individuals from the Mound of the Hostages, perhaps more. Think about what that continuity means. Generation after generation returning to the same place, the same low mound on the same green hill, to lay their dead among the dead who had come before. The tomb became a place of accumulation, not just of bones and ash, but of memory, of connection, of the unspoken agreement between the living and the dead that this ground is shared and sacred. Among the burials, one stands out with particular quiet poignancy. A teenage boy, buried around 2000 BCE during the early Bronze Age, was interred with exceptional care. He wore a necklace of amber, bronze, and jet beads, materials that had traveled considerable distances to reach him, speaking of trade connections and of a family or community wealthy enough to dress their dead in the finest things available. He was young, and someone had loved him, and they had placed him in the oldest and most sacred ground they knew. The name, the Mound of the Hostages, comes not from the tomb's original purpose, but from the mythology that gathered around the hill of Tara over the centuries that followed its construction. In medieval Irish tradition, Tara was the seat of the High Kings of Ireland, the symbolic center of the island, the place where sovereignty itself was understood to reside. The hostages referred to in the name were political hostages, kept at Tara as guarantees of the loyalty of lesser kings, a common practice in the early medieval period. But the mound itself is far older than any of those kings. It was already ancient, already mythologized, already wrapped in the kind of sacred significance that accumulates around a place over millennia. By the time the first High King sat on the stone of destiny at Tara and listened to it cry out beneath him, the people who built the Mound of the Hostages had no writing. They left no texts, no inscriptions, no explanations of what they believed or why they built what they built in the precise way they built it. What they left was the structure itself, the alignment, the carefully chosen stones, the passages that channel light at specific moments of the year. And the bones of their dead, held safe in the dark interior of the hill. What we can read in those stones and bones, if we read slowly and with patience, is a picture of people who understood their world with great sophistication. They knew the sky. They knew how to work stone. They knew how to organize collective labor and sustain a shared vision across the years it would have taken to complete a structure like this one. And they knew something about the relationship between the living and the dead that gave them the conviction to build a monument intended not just for one generation, but for all the generations that would follow. There is something in that conviction that reaches across the distance of 5,000 years and touches something still recognizable. The desire to be remembered, the hope that the people who come after will pause at the threshold of what you made and feel, even without knowing the details that something human and serious and full of care was here before them. Stand at the entrance to the Mound of the Hostages on a still morning, and the hill of Tara spreads out around you in its quiet green entirety. The land beyond is soft with mist. The air is cool and smells of wet grass and old earth. And the stone of the passage tomb is right there beneath your hand, solid, present, unchanged in any essential way, since the hands that placed it there 5 millennia ago released it and stepped back and looked at what they had made. The mound holds its silence, the hill holds its ground, and somewhere deep inside, in the dark where the winter sun reaches only once a year, the dead keep their long and patient rest. Sambor, Prei, cook brick temples. There is a forest in central Cambodia that keeps its secrets gently. It does not guard them with hostility or darkness. It simply holds them the way old places hold things, quietly and without urgency, wrapped in the green patience of trees that have grown tall over centuries of undisturbed silence. The light that filters through the canopy here arrives softened, broken into shifting patterns across the ground, and the air is warm and dense with the smell of earth and leaf and the slow breathing of a living landscape. This is the province of Kampong Tom, and deep within this forest, connected to the modern world by a road that winds through villages and rice paddies and the ordinary rhythm of Cambodian rural life, there is a complex of ancient brick temples that most people have never heard of, and that those who have visited tend never to forget. Sambor Prei Kuk. The name translates roughly as the temple in the richness of the forest, and that name is accurate in every sense. The forest has not been pushed back from these temples. It has been allowed to remain, to press close, to let its roots find the joints between ancient bricks and its branches shade the towers that have stood here since the 6th and 7th centuries of the Common Era. These temples predate Angkor Wat by several hundred years. That fact alone deserves a moment of quiet consideration. When most people think of the great architectural achievements of the Khmer civilization, their minds go immediately to Angkor, to those vast stone galleries and soaring towers that rise from the Cambodian plain like a dream of permanence. But Angkor came later. The civilization that eventually produced Angkor had to begin somewhere, had to learn somewhere, had to first discover in itself the capacity for that kind of monumental vision. Sambor Prei Kuk was part of that beginning. It was the capital of the Chenla Kingdom, one of the predecessor states of the later Khmer Empire, under the reign of a king named Isanavarman I, who ruled in the early 7th century. What he built here, or rather, what was built here across his reign and the reigns that preceded and followed him, was the largest pre-Angkorian temple complex in all of Southeast Asia. Let that settle for a moment. The largest of its kind, built from brick, in a forest more than 1,400 years ago. The brick itself is worth thinking about. These are not small bricks. They are large, dense, precisely made, fired to a hardness that has allowed them to survive more than a millennium of tropical heat and monsoon rain, and the slow, insistent pressure of tree roots and time. The people who made them understood the properties of their material with an intimacy that only comes from generations of practice. And the way those bricks were laid together is remarkable even now. The ancient Khmer builders did not use mortar in the conventional sense. Instead, they are believed to have used a kind of vegetable compound, a sticky resin-based substance that bonded the bricks to one another as it dried and cured. The result is a bond between brick and brick that has, in many places, outlasted the surrounding stone of other ancient structures built in different traditions entirely. Walk slowly through the complex in your imagination. The temples are arranged in 3 main groups, northern, central, and southern, spread across an area large enough that moving between them requires time and attention. Each group has its own character, its own atmosphere, its own particular way of holding the light that comes down through the forest canopy. The towers rise with a distinctive profile, tall and tapering, with multiple tiers of diminishing size stacked one above the next, each tier a smaller echo of the one below, the whole structure drawing the eye upward in a slow and deliberate progression toward the sky. This vertical emphasis was not accidental. These were Hindu temples, dedicated primarily to Shiva, and the tower form, the Shikhara, was a physical representation of Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain at the center of the Hindu universe, the axis around which all of creation was understood to turn. To build a temple in this tradition was to build a model of the cosmos. It was to say, in stone and brick and the careful geometry of sacred architecture, that this place is connected to the center of everything, that what happens here matters not just to the people who live nearby, but to the order of the universe itself. That is an extraordinary ambition to hold in your mind as you look at a brick tower in a Cambodian forest. But it was a genuine ambition, sincerely held, and the care with which these structures were built reflects the seriousness with which that belief was carried. The decorative elements of the temples at Sambor Prei are among the finest examples of early Khmer art that survive anywhere. The brick surfaces are carved, and this is one of the things that makes these structures so unusual, because carving directly into fired brick is a far more demanding task than carving into sandstone or applying decorative plasterwork. The craftsmen who worked here carved directly into the brick surface with a precision and a delicacy that produces, even after 14 centuries of weathering, images of extraordinary beauty. Devatas, divine female figures, stand in their niches along the temple walls, their postures graceful and their expressions serene. Kala faces, the fierce, wide-eyed masks that guard doorways and ward off malevolent forces, stare outward from above the entrance lintels with an intensity that the forest seems to soften rather than diminish. Floral and foliate patterns wind across surfaces with the same unhurried complexity as the roots of the trees that grow nearby. There is a conversation happening at Sambor Prei between the made and the natural, between the carved and the growing, that is one of the most quietly beautiful things in the ancient world. Today the site is a UNESCO World Heritage Property, recognized in 2017 for its outstanding universal value. But recognition has not stripped it of its atmosphere. The forest remains. The silence remains. The sense of stepping into a place where time moves differently, more slowly, more gently, remains entirely intact. Come here in the early morning, before the heat of the Cambodian day has fully established itself, and the light through the trees is golden, and the air is cool, and the brick of the towers is the color of dark honey in that soft early glow. The birds are loud at that hour. The forest is never truly silent, but the sound they make is part of the place rather than a distraction from it. These temples have been standing here since before the great cathedrals of Europe were imagined. They have watched the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of faiths, the slow transformation of the landscape around them. And still they stand, patient and warm in their forest, holding the memory of the people who built them with the same quiet care that the forest holds everything, gently, and without urgency, and for a very long time. The Broch of Gurness. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs only to the northern islands of Scotland. It is not the silence of emptiness. It is fuller than that, threaded through with the sound of wind moving across open water and the distant, unhurried rhythm of waves meeting stone. It is the kind of silence that settles into you slowly, the way cold settles into a room when the fire has been low for a long time. On the northeastern coast of mainland Orkney, where the land curves gently toward the Ain Hallow Sound, there is a place that holds this silence in a particular way. The grass here is short and wind-pressed. The sea is visible from almost every angle, gray-green and wide and patient, and rising from the earth at the edge of a shallow bay, surrounded by the rings of its own ancient outer walls, stands the Broch of Gurness. It has stood here for more than 2,000 years, and even in its ruined state, even with its upper courses long since tumbled, away by time and weather, it is a remarkable thing to look at. A tower of dry stone masonry, its walls still thick enough to walk inside, still hollow at the core, still speaking in the quiet language of stone about the people who built it and the world they lived in. A broch is a structure unique to Scotland, to the northern and western reaches, to the islands and coastal edges where the Iron Age settled into the landscape in its own particular way. There is nothing quite like a broch anywhere else in the ancient world. The Broch of Gurness dates to somewhere around 500 to 200 BCE, placing it in a world where iron tools had begun to change how people worked the land, but where fishing and farming and the careful tending of livestock still governed the shape of daily life. It was not built alone. Around the central tower, the community constructed a village, a close-pressed cluster of stone buildings, their walls sharing edges, their doorways opening onto narrow passageways that wound between structures like paths worn by long habit. The whole complex was then enclosed by outer ditches and ramparts, creating a layered boundary between the settlement and the open world beyond. Stand at the edge of those outer ditches in your imagination and look inward toward the tower. The broch rises at the center, solid, commanding, anchoring everything around it. Every structure in this settlement is oriented toward that central tower. Everything points inward. The walls of the broch are its most remarkable feature. They are not simply thick walls, they are hollow walls built as two concentric skins of carefully fitted stone with a narrow gap between them. That gap was divided at intervals by flat stone lintels into small internal cells, and a stairway wound upward through the wall itself. You could climb the broch from inside its own walls, rising through the darkness with one hand on the inner face of stone and the other on the outer, the wind muffled, the light coming only from narrow openings at each level. This hollow wall technique gave the broch its extraordinary combination of strength and efficiency. The entrance at ground level was low and narrow, the kind of opening that requires you to duck your head and turn sideways to pass through. This was deliberate. A narrow entrance is a defensible entrance. Anyone attempting to force their way inside would have to come through slowly, one at a time, exposed and vulnerable. Inside, the ground floor was a single round room with a central hearth. The smoke rose through the open center of the tower, drifting upward past the wooden floors of the upper levels and out into the Orkney sky. Imagine that room in the deep of a northern winter. The fire throwing light against curved stone walls. The wind outside reduced by those thick walls to a low and constant presence rather than a threat. People gathered close in the warmth. The smell of the fire, of food, of a life being lived in, full despite the cold and the dark. There is an intimacy to that image that crosses 2,000 years without difficulty. The need for warmth, the comfort of enclosure, the way a fire at the center of a room gathers people toward it and holds them there. The community at Gurness was connected to a wider world. The finds recovered from the site speak of trade and engagement. Iron tools, varied pottery, evidence of grain storage and animal husbandry. The sea was always present. From the broch, the Einhallow Sound is visible in its entirety, a stretch of water that is rarely calm and never truly silent. The people here would have known that water the way you know a neighbor. Its moods, its patterns, its moments of generosity and its moments of danger. They fished it. They watched it from the height of their tower, reading its surface for weather and approaching vessels and the slow seasonal changes that governed life in this northern place. In time, the broch fell quiet. The tower was subdivided and eventually abandoned. The village outside continued for a while, and then it too fell silent. What remains today is what the earth chose to keep. The lower courses of the walls, the outlines of the village buildings, the ditches that once held the outer ramparts. Enough to feel, standing at the edge of the site on a gray Orkney morning, that something warm and human once filled this place completely. The wind still comes off the Einhallow Sound. The grass is still short and salt-pressed, and the stones of the Broch of Gurness still hold their ground at the edge of the bay, patient and present. As the light moves slowly across the water, and the day turns quietly toward evening. Los Millares Fortifications. There is a place in the southeastern corner of Spain, tucked between the river Andarax and a quiet tributary that no longer carries much water, where the land rises gently from the valley floor and holds within it the memory of something extraordinary. The sun sets slowly here, and the light that falls across the earth in the evening hours is the color of old bronze, warm and heavy and still. The hills fold into one another like the pages of a book that has been read many times, worn soft at the edges, familiar in a way that goes beyond memory. This is the Almeria province of Andalusia, in southern Spain. And 5,000 years ago, long before the Romans ever walked these hills, long before the written word had found its way to this corner of the world, a civilization grew here that we are only now beginning to truly understand. They are called the people of Los Millares. And what they built here, the walls they raised, the towers they constructed, the careful and deliberate way they organized their world, speaks to us still across the silence of 5 millennia. Close your eyes and imagine the landscape as it was then. The air would have smelled different, rich with the resin of pine trees that no longer grow in such abundance, alive with the sound of water moving through channels the people had dug themselves, carrying life from the river to their fields. The settlement sat on a promontory, a natural rise of land that gave its inhabitants a clear view in every direction. To the south, the land fell away toward the sea. To the north and east, the mountains rose in their ancient, patient way, as they still do today. And surrounding the heart of this settlement, they built their walls. Not one wall, not a simple boundary of stone. They built 4 concentric lines of fortification, each one nested inside the next, each one a statement of intention and knowledge and skill that still astonishes the archaeologists, who study this site today. The outermost wall stretched across the landscape like a slow breath, enclosing an area that could have supported a population of hundreds. This was not a small gathering of families. This was a community, organized, purposeful, with a vision of permanence that drove them to move stone after stone into place under the Andalusian sky. Walk with the outer wall in your mind. Feel the roughness of the stone beneath your hand, or limestone and schist, gathered from the surrounding hills, shaped and fitted without mortar, held in place by weight and geometry and the patient skill of hands that understood how stone wants to sit against stone. At intervals along its length, the builders added semicircular bastions, rounded towers projecting outward from the main line, giving defenders the ability to see along the face of the wall, to watch the approaches, to understand at a glance whether something was moving toward them across the open ground. Archaeologists have counted 13 of these bastions along the outer circuit alone. 13 positions of elevated sight, placed with a care that tells us the people who planned this structure understood the geometry of defense in a way that was deeply sophisticated. Think about what it means to build a wall like this. Think about the number of people required, the labor, the coordination, the shared decision that this is what we will do together. A wall like this does not happen by accident. It does not grow from 100 individual choices. Someone had to imagine it whole before a single stone was moved. And then that vision had to be communicated, accepted, and carried out by enough people to make it real. This tells us something profound about the society that built it. There were leaders here, people with the authority or the persuasive power to organize labor on a massive scale. There was a shared identity strong enough that people gave their time and their strength to something that would benefit not just themselves, but everyone inside those walls. The walls were a statement. They said, "We are here. We have decided to stay. We are building something that will last beyond us." And it did last. The site at Los Millares was occupied for the better part of 1,000 years, from roughly 3,200 BCE to around 2,200 BCE. Generation after generation being born and living and dying within sight of those same walls, those same bastions, that same promontory, looking out over the same valley. The walls were repaired and rebuilt across the centuries, a community that kept choosing again and again to maintain what had been built, to honor the work of those who came before. Just beyond the walls, Scattered across the hillsides are the tombs. Over 100 megalithic burial chambers, built in a style where long stone passages lead into corbelled rooms covered by mounds of earth. These were collective spaces, used by successive generations, the bones of the old gathered, carefully to make room for the new. Every morning, the people of Los Millares rose and went about their work with those tombs visible from the settlement. The dead were not kept far away. They were neighbors. They were present. The land was not just where you lived. It was where your people had always lived, and where they would always rest. The walls, then, protected more than the living. They held together an entire world, the present and the past, the settlement and its sacred ground, the breathing and the silent alike. Let that thought rest gently with you now, as the night grows quiet around you. The idea that stone can carry meaning, that the act of building something permanent, something that will outlast you, is itself a kind of love for the people who will come after. In the darkness of the Andalusian hills, Los Millares still stands, worn by 5,000 years of wind and rain, but still there, still holding its ground, still keeping watch over the valley below, just as it always has.